Okay, so Francine Gordon is chair of the SVForum Tech Women and a pioneer in the modern women's movement. That's why I wanted to meet her, because she's a pioneer. You don't get to meet a lot of pioneers in the modern, well, because otherwise she would have been dead if it was the normal women's movement, right?
I was going to say, Susan Anthony is long gone.
I think I could edit it just to say the current women's movement of, making us be as awesome as we are to the world. After earning her PhD from Yale, she was one of the first 2 women on the faculty at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Does she rock or what? Woohoo! Okay? All right. Yes. That is so amazing. She's held senior management roles at several high-tech firms, and she spent 5 years with Boston Consulting Group as a global organization manager. That would be called a GOM. Just kidding. And co-founded a professional repertory theater. A woman after my own heart. My 3 children are actors. She works with global companies addressing innovation, teamwork, leadership, and, no secret here, the advancement of women. She teaches at Stanford Continuing Studies, Santa Clara University's Levy School of Business, and at Infotech in Mexico. How many of you would like to have a job where you get to go to Mexico every month and kind of just be like a teacher for a while? You are my new best friend. We're going to Mexico. Hablamos español. Okay? Y yo puedo ayudar a usted en sus clases. Y hablamos en español. Yo tengo... ¿Necesita un transitorio? Sí, estoy libre para usted. Okay. All right. Anyway, getting back to Mexico. Yes, and I don't wear a bikini, just so you know. So we will get right to work and just be on top of it. Her special interests include enhancing creativity in individuals and organizations and facilitating the development and advancement of women executives. Yes. A recovering perfectionist, my sister. She also helps professionals who have self-limiting beliefs and, my sister, unrealistically high standards, who they want to find themselves ways to free themselves, to achieve their full potential. If she wasn't busy enough changing the world for women all around the globe, she is the organizer of the TEDx Bay Area Women. Do we have a big round of applause for the beautiful Francine Gordon? Woo! Welcome.
Thank you. So wonderful to be here. Most of what I want to have you do is do some interaction and find out how we can all advance women globally. But let me give you just random thoughts. First of all, to put things in perspective about my background, and you'll appreciate this. While you were finishing up in 1972, I was on the faculty at the Stanford Graduate School of Business with my PhD in 1972. I'm really old, but not as old as Susan B. Anthony. And when I taught there, out of 600 students, there were 5 women. Wow. And it was really interesting because there were 2 women who were the admins across the hall from me, but they weren't my admins because nobody wanted to be an admin for a woman. So they had to find somebody else who was willing to take me on because, they wanted to work with the male professors, which I thought was rather interesting. So I sometimes describe myself as an accidental pioneer. When I was getting my PhD at Yale, I was the first woman in my department. And this was really interesting because I was in the last all-female graduating class at Vassar. So I went from being in the majority to being the only woman, which was quite a shock. And I figured out that's why one of the people, when I had gotten into Yale, I was also accepted into Berkeley. And it was much easier to drive to Yale than to go to Berkeley. And so I went up to Yale to talk to some of the faculty members, and this one professor named Ed Lawler, who had gotten his PhD at Berkeley, told me why I had to go to Yale, but he didn't tell me that one of the reasons was he wanted to have a woman in one of the classes. Not that he was anything untoward, I want to be clear about that. So things have really changed, and back in the 70s, Myra Strober, the other woman, and she's the one who started what was originally the Center for Research on Women. It is now the Clayman Institute. Myra Strober and I were the 2 women who came from the same public junior high school and high school in Brooklyn. Isn't that amazing? And we ran a conference in the 70s for male executives, which in the 70s was pretty unusual. But our feeling was it's not about men are bad, women are good. It's about we've all been socialized, and we need to deal with it. And by the way, when I talk about we've all been socialized, and I'm running through a lot of things quickly because I want to get to your interaction, but starting in the 60s until now, there's been a lot of research done where they'll do comparisons. They'll give 2 papers that were written, and the same exact paper, one's written by John, one's written by Jane. Or they'll now do things with entrepreneurs. We have 2 entrepreneurial teams that are going to be funded by VCs. Everything is identical, but one has all male, one has all female founders. These are all hypothetical. It doesn't matter who's doing the judging, male or female. The men are always rated higher. Same work rated higher if attributed to men. Same VC, same entrepreneurial venture, more likely to get money if it's attributed to men, although everything is the same, and women do that too. I want to be really clear. This isn't about the men are bad and they're doing it to us. We do it too because we've all been socialized. So that's one thing I want to kind of get out there, and I think we need to realize we've all been through this experience. Women do tend to hold themselves to a higher standard very often, and we sometimes get in our own way. I often say I am my biggest enemy. I'm the one who holds myself back. I like to blame other people, but I can't. It's really hard, you know? So that was one thing I wanted to say.
May I just make a comment? You know, you said we've all been socialized. It sounds like we've all been unsocialized.
You know, it's actually, if you want to, there's a whole thing. They say, you know, kids have totally open minds, and then we all get socialized, which is basically giving us less and less capability of what we can do. Right. So thank you. Absolutely, with others.
The definition of socialization.
Yeah, it is. It's really limiting. So yes, absolutely, I agree. Good point. Thinking about some of the things that we've heard this morning, first of all, I was delighted. Where's Steve?
He's outside networking.
He's outside.
He's almost leaving.
When Steve was talking, I thought it was fascinating he was talking about working with girls in India, because time and time again we are finding that women are the potential, particularly in underdeveloped nations. With microloans, it became quickly known that if you really want to leverage a microloan, give it to a woman. First of all, you're more likely to get it paid back. But more importantly, when a woman is successful, she doesn't go buy herself something. She goes and she invests in another woman and says, here's a loan, go get your own cow or buy your own piece of land or do whatever. Women tend to spread it around so everybody in the community rises. And nowadays, most microloans are going exclusively to women because they've had such a positive impact. So that's number one. Number two, I was doing seminars for Fulbright scholars from predominantly Muslim countries who are here getting masters and PhDs. And when I was doing these, most of the people there were male. There would be about 70%, 75% male, and the rest would be women, since that's all that's left after the males. And
you're out of touch.
That's true. You're right. You're right. And now Google now has what, 50 designations that you can ascribe yourself to, but in that day, there was only the 2. I stand corrected, and I literally stand. So, and I would do this whole thing about being social entrepreneurs and innovation and changing the world, and it never failed. The last day, it was a 4-day event. The last day, the men would be saying, well, this is all great, but this is not going to work. And the women would get up and say, you know, we're Fulbright scholars. They sent us here because we're going to make a difference. We're going to go out and do it. And I am convinced that if we could have women have more economic power, to have more political power, that we'd have a lot of change in the world. By the way, there's a book out called The Athena Doctrine by John Gazerma, and he did research with 64,000 people in 13 countries. And one of the interesting findings was men and women were dissatisfied with how men are running the world. 55% on average said, we don't like the way the things are going. And around 65% said, we wish men had more characteristics that women have. Isn't that interesting? So I thought that was kind of an interesting finding. And when you look at current trends in leadership, we're finding that, in general, many of the characteristics for contemporary leadership are really what we might consider to be more collaborative, more feminine, quote unquote. characteristics, like, you know, being able to work well with others and kind of managing conflict and being mindful of others and being willing to share the spotlight, et cetera, et cetera. Many of these things, being vulnerable is actually viewed as a good leadership characteristic, but it's really hard for men to be vulnerable because it's held against them. So it's kind of this interesting double bind that goes on. In terms of the time, I thought that was really interesting because one of the barriers in the Western world, particularly in the United States, one of the reasons women have a tough time getting into leadership is because there's an expectation of having a 90-hour work week, right? I mean, how many people here know people who work all the time? You know, we have 80 hours. Right? Everybody, right? Is there anybody who doesn't know anybody who works all the time? So, and it's interesting. It's sort of the tyranny of the expectation. Because there's an expectation that you're going to live, breathe, you know, your world is your work. A woman who actually says, I want to go home at 5 o'clock to feed my children, and then I'll work at home afterwards, which is what usually happens, is viewed as being less committed to their work than a man, except the man who is a solo father who's doing the same thing, and he's also held accountable as being less than. So the whole notion that spending more time is what makes us better employees, I think we have a real issue with taking our time back and that we need to do it. And of course, most of us, when we take vacation, I mean, how many people take a vacation and have no electronic devices with them, right? Exception, right? So even when you're on vacation, we say, isn't it great? We have flexibility. Yes, you can take your work everywhere, all the time.